Great, thanks, Sue. And welcome, everyone. We're very happy to have you here to learn from today's speaker, Usha James. So I'm Phoebe Jackson. I'm a Salties Fellow and a physics teacher at John Abbott College, and I'll be moderating today. Before we start today's session, I'd like to let you know that next Friday, February 9th, Salties is hosting a renowned scholar session at the same time slot as this one, so 2:30 to 4 next Friday. In that session, Dr. Cindy Mello-Silver will discuss how problem-based learning can be integrated into a variety of contexts, and she'll provide us with some evidence-supported methods for putting PBL into practice. So we hope to see you again in a week. Also, as Sue already mentioned, we have a very quick survey for you to answer at the end so we can keep supporting you as to your needs. Sue will post the link then, but she'll also just drop it in the chat every now and then in case you have to leave early. And if you have to leave and you haven't seen it, just ask in the chat. And now I'm very happy to introduce Usha James, the Executive Director of the Critical Thinking Consortium, which is a nonprofit organization that supports educators in teaching critical, creative, and collaboration skills. Usha is also a very experienced secondary and post-secondary teacher. She's authored multiple textbooks and pedagogical resources, and she's worked as an educational professional working with administration and organizations. So today, Usha is going to help us better understand how we can consider and perhaps rethink our assessment practices so that we can better support students' learning and success and avoid unnecessary barriers. She's going to ask some big questions about for whom our assessment practices work and for whom they don't work. And as always, she's going to keep an eye out for the practicalities of real teaching. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Usha. Enjoy.
Thanks, Phoebe, and thanks to Salties for having me here. It's been a real pleasure to be in contact with the organization over the years, and I'm just thrilled to, I hope I get to meet you all in some way or another through this session, which I'm hoping will be very interactive. And so please feel free. I know everybody will work with their own contexts with their video off or their video on, but I would invite you to engage in the chat box. We're going to have lots of opportunities and we're going to play a little bit together. So thanks so much for the introduction, Phoebe. I have been a teacher for many years and have been in this role at the Critical Thinking Consortium for quite a few years. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about the consortium before we get started. I've actually on the first slide here, there's a QR code that will take you right to our website. We have been around for about 30 years and have thrived through all sorts of challenges, including changing mandates at the provincial level, COVID and its challenges. And have been, I'm happy to say we've survived and thrived through all of that because our work is we really have a single mandate, and that mandate is to support anybody who's trying to nurture higher quality thinking in their learners. And so we work with post-secondary institutions, I work with school districts and ministries of education, we work with educators directly, and in any context. So today I'm going to be talking about the context of your disciplines at the post-secondary level. But for those of you who are joining from sort of a central role or an administrative role or a teaching and learning coach type of role, we're also thinking about how do we support people in taking up some of these concepts and support through implementation. So that's a little bit about me, but I would love to hear who you are. So in the chat box, let's just start to make sure everybody can access the chat. Maybe if you wouldn't mind telling us where you're joining from, which institution perhaps, and what your role is, and we can say hello to each other as we get started. So if you have a moment in the chat to pop in there, your name will show up anyway, but your role and which organization, institution you're coming to us from. And maybe if I've ever met you before, some of you have been attended, I think, some presentations that I've done at Dawson and other places. So I would love to know if we've met before. Welcome. Lovely. That's wonderful. Thank you. Keep going. I'm going to get started. But it's nice to be able to see all the various people who are joining and who have registered. And also I want to encourage you, I'm going to keep my eye on the chat. So if you have questions as you go, please feel free to pop them in there. And I will try to make sure that I'm staying on top of that. And I'm also going to invite some questions in a moment. But true to our approach. So at the Critical Thinking Consortium, we do not have a formula for inviting thinking, nor do we have a program. We have a research-based conceptual framework that can be applied to any educational initiative. So in this case, we are going to think critically about assessment and evaluation. There are many challenges that are facing us now facing students, from mental health to attendance to engagement, trying to support so many of our students with the variety of strengths and needs that they bring us. So we're going to focus on assessment and evaluation and try to look at those things with a reflective lens, and thinking about through that equity lens of for whom are our practices working and for whom are they not. So that's where we're going to go, and I'm going to apply the framework as we go and think about these things, and also explain some pieces of our framework as well. But true to our framework, we like to launch the learning immediately. So rather than talk at you a lot and then invite you to think, I'm going to invite you into the thinking right away. And we're going to start with evaluation, because it's always top of mind for people. So we're going to start there first with a question that I'm going to ask you to both think about and respond to in the chat. So I'm going to show you 4 different evaluation approaches. And in the chat box, as each of these come up, I'm going to ask you to make a call based on your own beliefs, understandings, background. Which of these evaluation approaches do you think would likely be most equitable if applied in your classroom and least equitable? And I know I have not defined any terms yet, so I'm inviting you into the thinking first. So from your perspective, which of these approaches might be most equitable and which might be least equitable? All you need to put in the chat is the number, the most, :1, :3, whatever it is, and least. Okay, so here we go. Here's the first approach to breaking down marks. The second, the third, and the fourth. Okay, so I'm going to give everybody 30 seconds to a minute to think that through. And in the chat box, what is your initial thinking about which approach is likely to be most equitable and which is likely to be least equitable? If you're putting a number in, let us know which is, if it's most or least. it depends. I noticed that as the very first thing that somebody said, and then it comes up again. But I am asking you to make an initial decision, and that's going to be important as we return to it. I invite you to sort of skim through what people are saying. And I want you to notice the variety of perspectives that are there. Also going to be a critical observation as we move forward. I'm going to ask people to in the chat box, or perhaps we can hear. I'm happy to hear from one or two of you if you would like to take the mic. Feel free to put a hand up, and we can hear your voice. But let's take the people. A number of people said sorry, let me get back into the chat. A number of people said number 2 was most equitable. So might somebody who said that, and there's no right or wrong answer here, we're just looking for perspectives, but somebody who said number 2 in the chat box or on the mic, what made you think that that was most equitable? Okay, so thanks. In the chat box, somebody said it gives multiple options for students to apply their learning and their low stakes outcomes, even if they are mistakes. So many different opportunities and low stakes outcomes. Any other thoughts? People who said number 2 was most equitable. Okay, on opposite perspective, Phoebe, but number 2 doesn't give students time to go back and show they've learned over the semester. They have a one-shot chance. So that might be a reason that something is less equitable. Somebody else. A lot of people have agreed with one of them or another. Multiple opportunities to learn. The activities or the evaluation is linked directly to the course outcomes, which have been shared. So there's a transparency, which seems to be important in people's thinking about equity. Other thoughts? Too many. Okay, thanks, Carolyn. So sometimes having too many assignments can be overwhelming for students, too many low stakes assignments, and that can seem or feel, most inequitable for folks. Okay, let's pick a different one. Suzanne, thank you. That maybe number 2 is about outcomes and not competencies related to the course. There's no hierarchy, and some might be more valuable than the others. Thank you for all of those responses. Let's go to a different one. Some people have said number 4 is most equitable. What are your reasons behind that? Why would you have selected number 4 as most equitable? Different forms of assessment. So there are different ways of learning or demonstrating your learning. Absolutely. The variety that's there. So notice what's emerging is as we unpack which of these seems most or least equitable, some criteria are rising to the surface. And so whenever we're making decisions, whether it be it about our learning activities or about assessment or about evaluation, there are criteria that will rise to the surface. And if equitable is one of those criterion, then there's really powerful opportunities for us as a group or in your departments or across your course teams to unpack what does that mean? And how will we know what is equitable or not? It's really going to depend on knowing our students, understanding our students well. And that may change from cohort to cohort. So there's a number of different factors, but when we engage in a process like this, where we look at a variety of options, and we select or sort of force a choice amongst those options, it brings to the surface some criteria. And that's really at the core of our framework at the Critical Thinking Consortium. If we are going to think critically about our practice, a huge piece of that is thinking about criteria. I'd like to just take this one step further and say that what we evaluate sends a message about what we value. And so students infer from how we set up our evaluation what we care about. And often there's a disconnect between what students think we care about the most and what we do care about the most. So knowing that, that our evaluation sends a message about what we value, can you please put on your sort of hat, think through the perspective of some of your students and go back to these 4 options. And if you had to pick one of these, it doesn't matter which one, pick one, and from a student's perspective, what might they infer that we care most about as an instructor or as a program based on that particular way of breaking down their marks? Pick any one, and in the chat box, give us the number, and what do you think it shows that we value? While we're doing that, Carolyn, thanks for the question about the distinction between evaluation and assessment. I'll say my personal use of language is to use the word assessment to mean all forms of providing feedback and guidance about student learning. So I often use the term interchangeably, or to mean both assessment and evaluation. I have noticed, however, that if I don't distinguish between the two, that there sometimes is confusion around what I'm talking about. So I'm right now using the term evaluation to mean when it comes to judging student understanding, learning, competency by putting a mark on it. That act of judging, as opposed to assessing, which means checking in on. I mean, assess comes from the root, the root to sit beside. So noticing, observing, and that can be done by the instructor, by the student themselves, by their peers, noticing to what degree a certain concept or competency is being demonstrated, and then providing feedback and guidance. Yes, I'm using both terms, but I often use assessment as an umbrella term, so I'll foreground that. So looking at the comments in the chat box, so some people are saying number 4 shows that performance is valued. Might show that we value tests, that we place a value on the work as opposed to on the recall. Some things says we value each course outcome equally. Sometimes I feel like students come away thinking we value their ability to write a test versus valuing their understanding or their competency in the discipline. And that's a dangerous thing to signal, I think. Because if they think that we value their ability to recall and write a test in the moment, then from their perspective, it doesn't matter if they retain that. It just matters that they did it in the moment. So I invite you to think critically. Today, I'm going to invite you to think critically about your assessment and evaluation practices. And there are a number of different ways we're going to come at that. Part of what we do at the Critical Thinking Consortium, I'm going to model a number of practices today. So we take a critical inquiry approach to learning. And that critical inquiry approach, we invite students into it in classrooms, but if we value it, I always make sure that I'm also using it in sessions. And so I'm going to use it today. We're going to play with it today. And I hope that it will model a little bit what this approach might look like. So there are a couple of key components in a critical inquiry approach. We've started by launching the thinking. And I will continuously engage you in thinking critically about the practices that I either show you or your own practices. And launching early is a really important component. Another important component of a critical inquiry approach, and I'm going to make the connections to equity as we go, is to frame learning with a critical inquiry question. So I use critical inquiry questions in all learning that I facilitate, whether it's for a single session, for a single lesson, for a unit, or for an entire course. And so whether it's at this, secondary or post-secondary level, I have framed critical inquiry questions for the entire course, which students are introduced to on day one. And they are, then they wrap up and share their demonstrate their understanding of or their response to in the final days of the course as well. So today I framed a critical inquiry question for us to engage in, and that is as follows: how might powerful commitments and routines around assessment and evaluation help us create inclusive and equitable learning environments? And I've used this language of commitments and routines because it's more than just a single practice. What do I commit to as an instructor or whatever my role might be in terms of assessment and evaluation? Those are the principles that guide my assessment and evaluation. They guide my decision, the criteria that guides my decision making. As students come up and challenge me or ask me for something, what are those commitments that I have? And how do I articulate them both to myself and to my students? And routines. So what are routines around assessment and evaluation? What do I do regularly? What do I do at the beginning of every class? What do I do at the end of every class? What do I do 3 weeks before a test? What do I do after a test? What are the routines that I also will ensure that I embed that help us create inclusive, equitable learning environments? Now, a critical inquiry question is supportive of learning because it is broad and there are multiple entry points. A really good critical inquiry question can support inclusive learning environments and enhance critical thinking because people can engage right from the beginning. Nobody is a blank slate. So when we frame our courses with a critical inquiry question and we invite people to think about it from the beginning, there is an entry point for learning for most of our learners. However, they are broad. And it's very hard to assess responses to a critical inquiry question because this same inquiry question could engage me, as a very new instructor, and it could also engage me from somebody who's been around for 25 years instructing. So how do we then take something that is so broad that I can return to over the course of my entire career or my entire learning experience, and then make it manageable so I can actually assess my progress towards it? So part of our approach is we pair a critical inquiry question with what we call a critical challenge. Critical challenge is a concrete, measurable task that is a piece of the inquiry question that gets me a few steps towards a response to that inquiry question. The metaphor I often use, some of you have heard me use it before, the metaphor I often use is that a really good critical inquiry question is like the horizon at sunset. You never get tired of it. Everybody wants to go see the sunset, look towards the horizon at sunset. That's what a good critical inquiry question is like. It engages me. It entices me. It draws me into it. But like the horizon, you will never reach it. You can walk towards it your whole life. You will never get to it. A critical challenge is a concrete task that takes you closer to that horizon or it gives you a better view of it, but it's a concrete, measurable task. It's like the mountaintop. I know I need to, I can plan to get to the top of it. I can gauge my progress when I'm halfway up. When I get to the top, I can look back and see how I've done. It's concrete. But when I get to the top, the horizon is even more beautiful and enticing and interesting. So that's the way that I describe the relationship between an inquiry question and a challenge. And so when we invite learners in our classrooms to engage in inquiry questions, we tell them right off the bat, what is this course about? What are we all going to be grappling with through this whole course? What is important to us? And what do I want you to be thinking about? And the critical challenge, when we invite students to engage with it right at the beginning of a course, it says to them, there's no surprises here. This is what we're going to do by the end. This is not about an exam at the end, it's about a response. So the critical challenge that I'm going to invite you to engage in, because we only have an hour and a bit together, is this. I'd like you by the end of today, and you're not handing it in, don't worry, no pressure, just for yourself. I'd like you to identify some powerful commitments and routines around assessment and evaluation that you will. There are 4 categories of commitments and assessments, commitments and routines. Number 1, what are those that you will affirm? Affirm means you're already doing them and you're going to keep doing them. This is part of my practice. And what I hear today is exactly, it's affirming that this is something I want to keep doing. Second, what are some commitments and routines that you might refine? You're already doing them, but you're going to change them a little bit. You might say, you know what, I use an inquiry question, but I don't introduce it till halfway through the year. Now I'm going to start introducing it on day 1. So are there things you might refine? Are there some things that you might adopt based on our conversation today? Might you say, that's a great idea. I would like to do that. And last but not least, but almost very important, is what will you abandon? Is there anything that you will no longer do as a result? So a critical challenge, here's a concrete task I'm asking you to start by the end of our time together. Start by the beginning of our time together, complete or continue at the end of our time together. But I'm going to give you a little template in which to do it. So you can create this template on your own, or if you'd like, I've created one for you and I've put it in a Google Doc. The reason I'm giving you something sort of tangible, a tangible space in which to respond to this is, again, to model a structure that we use. It's a structure to support thinking. It's a structure that supports assessment. And it's a structure that I'll come to show you can help lead to more inclusion and more equitable outcomes. That structure is a thought book. We call it a thought book. A thought book is a place separate from the notes you're taking. So it's a separate piece of paper. It's a separate file on your digital device. In your classroom, it can live somewhere else, online, in, an actual physical, tangible space. But it's separate because the only thing you put in there is your response to this question. Over the course of the next hour, we are going to return to this thought book multiple times. And every time we return to it, you're going to add to it. And I hope that as you add to it, you will see your thinking grow. So students, when they use a thought book, it affirms a number of things for them. It helps them see that your first thinking is not your final thinking, that you will learn and grow your thinking about this particular challenge throughout this course. It also helps them understand that it's good to change your mind, that flexibility of thinking is valued, because every time you go to it, you might change something. You might add something, but you might remove something. It also helps them understand that thinking is messy. So contrary to popular belief, where some people just always get it and they're always good at things and some people are not. That's often something that students believe about themselves. Right? Some people are good at doing school and some people are not good at doing school. And we see that sort of perfectionism playing out in mental health amongst our students. It tells us thinking is messy. And that's okay. We're not striving for perfection. We're striving for progress. So I'm going to ask you to start a thought book. I have created a little template, which you don't have to use, but I've put there's a QR code there on the screen that if you would like, you can, and I'll put the link to this document if you don't want to use a QR code. I will put the link to this document in the chat. You can access it if you would like to play with it. You will have to, I think, make a copy of it from a Google Doc. But if not, if you don't want to access it, you can just make a chart somewhere that says affirm, refine, abandon, adopt, what commitments and routines. I'm going to just give you 30 seconds of quiet to organize that, either access it or start a thought book somewhere, and then we're going to dive right in. I know it's always unusual to have quiet during a session, specifically an online session, but I'm really committed to giving people time. Will you let me know in the chat if you were able to access it or not, if you're trying to? Thanks, Victoria. Okay, so knowing that this is our question for today, what powerful commitments and routines around assessment and evaluation will you affirm, refine, adopt, and abandon this year? I'd like to put it back to you. What are your most pressing questions, concerns, or priorities around assessment and evaluation and the impact on equitable and inclusive environments? What are your most pressing questions or concerns or priorities right now? In the chat, what's rising to the top of your mind? If you had to say, Usha, by the end of this session, could we please talk about X? What would that be? I'll give you a minute to name some questions in the chat if you'd like. I'm really good with wait time, so I'll wait another 20 seconds and see if there are any questions that emerge. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, I think that often when we talk about equitable approaches to assessment or evaluation, people are talking about different ways to evaluate whether students have adopted a particular concept, understood a concept, or a competency, have acquired a competency. They are looking at different assessment methods, evaluation methods. That's one way of thinking about equity. But in many of your disciplines, there are certain things they have to be able to do, and that you can't ask them to do a number of different things. There's some things everybody has to be able to do. So what does equity look like in that particular context? We will definitely talk about that. How do we engage neurodivergent students? Thank you. Excellent question. So I hope that we have some things today that will spark some of that thinking about how to engage neurodivergent students. Assessing reliability of exams. Is that what you meant? I think it's Michael. Reliability of
Yeah,
exams.
saying like I'm required to give to give an exam, but I want to be sure that the exam is written well, so that there's some classic examples of badly written exams which don't assess students equally based on all kinds of factors that shouldn't be part of the assessment.
Yeah, thank
So
you
I
for
was
that. Yeah.
wondering if you could speak on that, mention that, if that's
Yeah, we could actually do a whole session, and maybe, feel free to get in touch with me later on how to tweak or think about exams or other sort of traditional assessment methods, tests, labs, etc., through that lens of equity and different ways to tweak it. But I will definitely address that in some ways. Sensitive topics that might offend people. Yeah, that's a good question as well. How do we think through the lens of equity, not just in how we shape our assessments, but also if we're looking for more equitable outcomes, what kinds of things are we talking about in class? How are we inviting students to bring their whole selves into that class? How are we being cognizant of identities and our own identities? We will talk about that a little bit as well. How do you co-construct expectations together? I have some good examples. I'm not sure we'll get them to them today, but if we don't, please make sure that you connect with me about how to co-construct some of those pieces together. Yeah, equitable grading when you give people options. What does that look like? Absolutely. And UDL, Universal Design for Learning, does it answer the question of equity? We're going to talk about UDL and what's a way to think about that as well. Thanks. So we're going to, Elizabeth, I'm going to get to the thought book, those 4 quadrants in the thought book right now. So thanks for your question. If you've downloaded the thought book, it's still in the chat if you didn't get a chance to already, and we'll bring back that QR code if you need it. So I'm going to walk through a number of practices today. And as we walk through those practices, I've organized them into 4 quadrants. So in each of these quadrants, we'll talk about different commitments, different routines. And so as we talk about each one, I'll pause. And so, for example, we're going to talk about prepare first. So we'll talk about prepare first and all of the practices that fall into that quadrant. And so you'll see that same quadrant in the thought book. And so as you listen and engage in the thinking, are there some practices, some commitments, some routines that you would like to capture and say in that quadrant and say, yes, I'm going to keep doing this. I want to affirm this because I do it, or I'm going to abandon doing something that, I used to do in this area. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope it does in showing you the relationship between what I'm going to present and the thought book. So we're going to look at a number of different practices. I suggest that these practices could be organized as follows. In terms of assessment and evaluation, we need to prepare ourselves before coming up with the way that we are going to assess and evaluate students. We need to prepare how to see student learning clearly. How will we clearly see student learning? It's sort of polishing the lenses of our glasses. We will need to uncover student learning. Much that has to do with equitable, inclusive learning environments has to do with not being able to see the thinking of students, not making it visible, and therefore not knowing what's going on, and therefore not being able to evaluate it. So if we see inequitable outcomes in our classrooms, is it because we haven't been able to get some insight into some students' abilities, into some students' thinking, into some students' understanding? How do we make every student's thinking, understanding, abilities visible so that we actually can assess and evaluate them? Third, there are practices related to making sure that we take an iterative approach to learning. And so many of you pointed that out in that first activity that we just did, that are there multiple opportunities for students to revisit learning and change their mind to show us again? Or does learning come and go, and whatever they learned in this week or this unit or this month, they never get a chance to revisit and grow their thinking about? And finally, how do we equitably, thoughtfully capture the journey of students learning? Because there are wonderful ideas in each of these practices, but practically, how am I going to know every student where they're at, if I'm going to start providing a variety of choices, or if I'm going to start to not rely as heavily on those high stakes assessments? How am I going to then capture the learning along the way so that I can put a mark on it? So these are the 4 categories that we're going to play in today. And hopefully there'll be some practices in each of them that you might walk away with in terms of your thought book, and that they'll approach the questions as well that you've shared in the chat box. So let's start with prepare. How might we prepare to see clearly? When we talk about inequitable outcomes for students, what we're talking about is disproportionality. So when you think about your class and who seems to be achieving and who doesn't seem to be achieving, it's important to know right now you are in the middle of courses right now, many of you. So, or maybe in the last term, who seemed to succeed, who excelled, who didn't? Do you know the individual students? But as importantly, can you step back and do you see patterns? Do you see patterns amongst whom is not succeeding? What do we know about students in order to actually know what those patterns are? So when we start to see patterns, and those patterns can show up in a variety of ways. They might be about various students' identities, their circumstances, their environments. There might be a number of different things. But when we start to see patterns, it tells us something about ourselves, not just about our students. It tells us something about our own practice. When we examine the data of achievement in our classes, in a particular class or over time, it's not just a window into our students' lives, it's a mirror that tells us something about our own practices. So as we go through each of these, I'll invite you to think about your own practice. So the first area is, how do we prepare ourselves to clearly see each student's learning? I'm going to suggest 3 practices that we might engage in to help us see clearly. First, we need to focus and filter what matters most before we start teaching. What is it that we're looking for? Yes, that shows up in the course outcomes that we've thought about previously, the course competencies that we've thought about previously. But it's worthwhile to revisit that conversation. So we're going to talk about focus and filter. It's worthwhile to anticipate. If I'm going to try something new in my class, can I anticipate what I might see as students engage in learning? And finally, as part of preparing, can I reflect on what might cloud my vision? What might actually get in the way of me seeing my students learning clearly? So let's go to the first one. Focus and filter. I think it's a worthwhile practice before beginning a course, before meeting my students, to think about what will I need to know about my learners and what will I need to know about their learning along the way, in order to know if they're getting out of this course and to support their learning along the way. So I often do an exercise with people where we think about all the things we might need. Let's start with the learner. What are the things you need to know about your learners in order to support them well? Is it important to know what their background knowledge is that they're bringing? Is it important to know what their life experiences are? Is it important to know how they learn? Is it important to know what's worked for them in the past and what hasn't worked for them? What's important to know about them? And sometimes I find it useful because you can come up with a very long list to organize those things into what's crucial to know about my learners, what might be helpful to know, and what's, nice to know about them, but not crucial. Once we identify what's crucial to know about our learners, we need to think about how we can find that out as early as possible in our course. How will we find it out? So if you're interested in their background knowledge, what's the best way to learn that early? So, people do, information sheets where they invite students to tell us a little bit about themselves. People do, diagnostic quizzes at the beginning to see how much they've carried over from a previous year. There's a number of different things people do in their courses to try to find out about their learners before they start learning. But I'm going to tell you that even inviting students to engage in a critical challenge like we did at the beginning, those four, here are four things. Which one would you select for whatever reason? I mean, it has to be useful. That has to be relevant to your course material. And then listening to that dialogue teaches us something about them, teaches us what they know already. It tells us something about how comfortable they are engaging in productive discussion. It tells us many things about them. What do you need to know about your learners? Assessment, I like to say, is about learning, constantly learning our learners. Assessment is about learning our learners. So if I'm going to do an activity in class, why am I doing it? What will it help me learn about my learners? Because if it's not helping me learn anything about them, it's not useful to me in knowing what I should do next. So I want to be able to watch them in order to coach them. Somebody asked a question earlier about some practical courses. Oops, I'm gonna go back there. Let me go back there for a second. About some practical courses. How do we do sort of a variety of different assessments when we have a very particular practical competency that students have to be able to demonstrate? Well, if you have a very practical competency that students have to be able to demonstrate, is it worthwhile to invite them to try that right up front? Low stakes, something engaging. Would that give you some insight into who already comes with something? Something very technical career program, somebody said. So is it helpful to engage them in some of that thinking right up front and get to know them a little bit? Then secondly, what is it crucial, helpful, and nice to know about their learning? What do you really need to know about them before they leave your class in order to know that they are prepared? And how much of what you typically test Do you think they are retaining? To me, that's a really crucial question. Because if you're teaching for competency and for core concepts, you might think we need to cover these pieces. I need to test for these pieces. But if they are not going to retain those pieces, if 90% of it is going to evaporate out of the top of their head as they walk out the door of the classroom, then we are really not learning what we need to know about their abilities. We're just learning whether they have the ability to memorize. So I invite you to think at the beginning, what is it that's crucial for me to know that they have left my class with? Because if they're not leaving my class with this thing, with this ability, with this understanding, then I, haven't done what I want to do. I haven't supported them in the way that I want to. So focus and filter as an early way of preparing, I think, is really important. The next element of preparing, I think, is anticipating. What might I see as they engage in learning? And I think anticipating has to do with looking at which types of assessments are going to garner me the information I need to see whether they are getting those concepts and acquiring those competencies. So Michael asked a good question earlier. Are the things that I'm asking in the exam valid for understanding what I need to understand most about them? That is about anticipating. And I'm suggesting we do that prior to a course starting or early in a course, as opposed to waiting till I'm writing the exam and then thinking about the validity of questions. Because maybe there are some things I need to know about them that an exam is not going to tell me anyway. So what is it that I'm trying to see? And then what kinds of things will help me see that? So for example, what are seminar discussions going to help me see if I watch them unfold? If I give students a problem to solve and I invite them in class to solve it collaboratively, what would that help me understand about their understanding? If I'm asking them to do some practical application, what is that going to help me see? So each of these ways of demonstrating learning, I first need to sort of think through, what is that going to help me see? And similarly, what are more traditional ways going to help me see? What is a test going to really help me know about a student? If you look back on tests you've given or exams you've given, what is it going to help me know? And I'm also going to say that lectures don't help me know anything about my students. So when you think about having students in class, I'm not saying we shouldn't lecture. I'm saying when you think about having students in class, when we lecture, that actually doesn't garner me any information about students. So part of equitable and inclusive learning environments is being attuned to what your students are acquiring along the way and adjusting your approaches, both your teaching approaches and your evaluation approaches for them if they're not getting things. And that's a shift for some, I think, not for everybody, but for some. So if you're going to be attuned to how much your students are getting along the way, we need to have a variety of ways to see what they are acquiring. The third part of preparing to see clearly is reflecting. Reflecting on what might cloud my vision. So some things, I'm not sure how much each of you are talking about it in your institutions, but thinking through a lens of equity, it's worthwhile to consider how each of our identities, our experiences, our values, our worldviews, how they impact how we decide to assess and evaluate. There is nothing neutral about assessment and evaluation. And that's maybe it's not something that's new for you, but there's nothing neutral about it. even if we say we're doing multiple choice tests that are randomly generated, there's nothing neutral about it because there's nothing neutral about the random generation and the algorithms that go into that. There is nothing neutral. So because there's nothing neutral, it's important for us to reflect on what is influencing my choices. And we can't deny that our own identities and our own experiences influence our choices. If something worked for me as a student, I'm more likely to believe it will work for everybody else. If something didn't work for me, I'm more likely to believe that it's not valuable. And that's at a very sort of basic level. When we look at identities, there are a lot of things that we might inquire into. So something you might consider doing in your institutions is really thinking through the lens of power and privilege and identifying where you locate yourself. And this is an example of a wheel of power or privilege. It's not perfect. It's not comprehensive. It's just an example. And there's lots of different examples you can find out there. But I give you a moment to sort of think through where you identify yourself as an educator on this wheel of power and privilege, and how where you locate yourself might influence what you value, and therefore what influences your assessment and evaluation processes. It might be hard to make that connection right now. I'm not giving you a lot of time to do it, but I'm inviting you to think about, as you reflect on assessment and evaluation, what is the role of our identity in what we choose to do? And then if we start to see patterns, especially disproportionate patterns of achievement or lack of achievement in our classes by identity, then that tells us something about what we understand or don't understand about other worldviews or approaches. So somebody asked about, how do I engage neurodivergent students, for example? If I have no experience of neurodivergence, it's a very valid question to ask. If I'm not asking the question, it might be because I have no experience of it. So what I understand from my own social location is definitely going to influence how the learning activities I select, the way I transmit information, the assessment practices, my evaluation practices. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a minute. So that's sort of our first quadrant. How do we prepare to see clearly? So how might we focus and filter what matters most? How might we anticipate who's likely to engage in these activities? Who's not likely to engage in these activities? Who is this evaluation going to help? For whom is it not typically helpful? Who doesn't generally do well in these particular activities, assessments, or evaluations? And then to reflect. What is it about me that might be clouding my vision? And what am I willing to understand better about my own limitations, my lack of understanding, how my social location influences my choices. I'm going to be quiet now for a minute, and I'm going to invite you to go back to your thought book. If there's anything in that first quadrant, preparing to see clearly, that makes you think about practices you're now going to do, maybe you'll adopt, or maybe something you already do that you feel really affirmed about, or something that you might refine, something you're already doing, and you're gonna change it a little bit. Maybe something that you've always done and now you're thinking, I'm not going to do that anymore. Is there any commitment or routine around assessment and evaluation that we've just talked about you'd like to capture in that first quadrant? I'm going to be quiet for a whole minute, give you a chance to process before we move on. Okay. Minute goes by fast. Sometimes it seems like an eternity. Quiet, especially when you're in Zoom. But I hope it's helpful to have a little bit of time to process. Certainly, many of our students need that, and I think most adults need that. Let's go to the second quadrant, uncover. How do we then make every student's thinking ability, their understanding, how do we make it visible so that we can appropriately assess it? So we've prepared to see clearly. Now how do we make there something to see? So let's look at that quadrant now. So we're going to do another activity just to illustrate what it might look like. Okay. So not dissimilar from the first activity. So it's going to have some things that are the same. I'm going to show you 4 different options, and I'm going to ask you to select. You have to select now between one of the 4. Okay. You can't say it depends. I'm going to ask you to select between these 4 options. I'm going to pick 2 concepts that we're talking about today. You could pick any 2 concepts in your course. Okay, so it's just an example of how you might make thinking visible. Okay, so I'll give you 4 diagrams, and the 2 concepts that I'm going to invite you to consider are thinking as a concept and learning as a concept. What is the relationship between thinking and learning? There's 4 diagrams. Which diagram best illustrates the concept, the relationship? Is that if one circle is thinking and one circle is learning, is this a good illustration of the relationship between thinking and learning? Is this a good relationship between thinking and learning? Is this a good relationship between thinking and learning? Is this a good relationship between thinking and learning? Okay, so could you please, in the chat box, take a moment. Which do you select? And feel free in the moment to say why, or I'll ask you later. So maybe let's just start with the letter A, B, C, or D. Which is the best illustration? Not saying it's perfect. What's the best illustration of the relationship between thinking and learning? Oh, very interesting. So we've got lots of people coalescing around C and D, and we have 1 B. And not everybody has responded yet. So I won't put you on the spot, but for the person who said B, or 2 people who said B. Okay, thanks, Dan. Assumptions about thinking dictate assumptions about learning. And somebody else, I think, said B. What is your reason for saying B is the best illustration? In the chat box or on the mic, I'm good with either.
I'm in my car, but I think you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Hi, everybody. This is Dan. I've presented previously, and folks will know that I argue pretty strongly that assumptions about the nature of knowledge dictate the way that knowledge is gained. And so you really can't, in my opinion, it makes no sense to talk about learning if you have not defined your assumptions about knowledge itself.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And Christine mentioned that thinking leads to learning. So there's sort of a causal relationship that if you're thinking about something, then you will learn about that thing. Lots of people said C. Why did you say C? Why is C the best illustration for you? And maybe what's the inner circle and what's the outer circle? Again, feel free to take the mic if you would like, or in the chat box. Okay, couple of different explanations coming up there. The outer is thinking, and nestled inside is learning. Okay, not everything that is learning is thinking, or not everything that is thinking gets learned. Okay, lots of different explanations there. And D, people who said D, why? Why is that the best illustration? You can't have learning without thinking. Okay, now there's some debate going on. What do we mean by learning? Okay. Inextricably linked. Okay, simultaneous, etc. Okay, great. So now I'm going to suggest this. Imagine this was my class, and my class was about thinking and learning. I could have used this activity to make your current understanding visible. Your current thinking about these two concepts, thinking and learning, visible. And then perhaps in my class, maybe I'm teaching a class on critical thinking, but I made it visible. I've heard some of your responses. I could now go on to say, how come that activity was an example as you engaged in it? I might say, you were actually thinking critically during that activity. And I might say to you, so why am I saying that that was an example of critical thinking, the way you engaged in that activity? And I might invite some of those responses from you. And then I might go on to give you some information. I might say, we at the Critical Thinking Consortium, here's how we define critical thinking. Here's one definition, a pedagogical definition, really, of critical thinking. So through this activity, I started by making your thinking visible. I then invited you to use that experience, that experiential learning of engaging in something, to offer a definition yourself. Why was that critical thinking? Why do you think it was critical thinking? Why do you not think it was critical thinking? And then I've offered you some background knowledge. Notice how I've flipped what often happens on its head. Often in classrooms, we give students information, then we ask them to make sure they've understood that information, then we ask them to apply the information. When we flip it on its head, we're inviting them to experience something, to use that experience to draw out learning, and then to attach a label or enhance what they've learned with some theory or some background information or a definition or whatever it might be. That simple flip can lead to more equitable and inclusive learning environments because you're inviting everybody in, you're watching them, you're making adjustments as you go to ensure that a variety of different ways of acquiring a concept are all embedded. If we only use one of those ways, we're much less likely to capture the broader spectrum of ways of learning. Also, I think it honors the fact that people's lived experiences lead to different beliefs, understandings, and capabilities. And so by starting with what people bring into a situation, you're honoring to a degree, depending on what you're doing in your class, those lived experiences, or you can be as well. I might ask you sort of what might I have learned when I observed and listened to you as you grappled with this challenge. So imagine that we were in a classroom and you were sitting in groups of 4 or in pairs. And then the two of you at your table, as I saw there was some debate online here about who would say what and what was a better response. If I was hovering over that table of 4, if I was listening to you, or if I was even watching this online discussion in a little bit more closely, I will have learned something about your understanding of these concepts, but I also will have learned about your ability to promote an argument. I would have learned about your ability to be flexible in your thinking, about your ability to connect to theory. I will have learned something about you. And if I've learned that about you, Now I can either evaluate that in the moment, which is, I think, difficult to imagine. But if I've noticed that you're able to advance an argument, and it just happens to have happened in a moment as opposed to in an essay, that if it meets a course outcome, I could potentially evaluate that course outcome in that moment. That might be a big leap, but if I've noticed, if I've focused and filtered what I care about the most, I might see it right now. And if I see it right now, does that count? Can that count? And I think that that's a way of thinking about different methods of evaluation a little bit differently. Because yes, I can give choice, or I can provide different opportunities for students at the end of a unit or the end of a course. You can demonstrate your learning in this way. But I wonder whether some of that learning can get demonstrated in the moment. And I imagine those of you who have technical courses, very practical courses, are much more used to that. You see students engage in those technical abilities in the moment. And you might be able to give them feedback, and you may even be evaluating them in the moment. There are lots of different ways to frame these types of activities. I won't go into them in any detail, but I will be happy to share if any of those help. Suzanne, it's a good question. Is it equitable to evaluate what you overheard if you weren't in the right place to hear someone else's learning? Such a good question. So you will have to see if this works in your courses or not. And so, I certainly don't have all of the answers here. But I will say that if you have narrowed what matters most to a small core group of competencies, and you are engaging in a critical inquiry approach like this regularly, then you might see one person demonstrate, let's just take an example, the ability to effectively support an argument with powerful evidence framed by theoretical frameworks or concepts or whatever it might be, right? So if that's an outcome, that in my course, that's what students have to be able to do, then I might have multiple different activities where I could ensure. Now, if you have, I don't know, 150, 200, 500 students, you may not be able to do this. If you have 50 students, you may be able to position yourself in ways that you will be able to it might not just be happenstance overheard. You might create opportunities for students to grapple with the challenge in front of you, and you might very intentionally sit with those students. So a systematic way of getting to different students in the moment that they are grappling with a challenge. It may be possible. It may not be possible in very large classes to do it as easily. There are ways to do it online, whether you're doing things in breakout rooms or you're finding ways for students to engage with the screen. It is tougher though. Absolutely, it's tougher. So I absolutely won't suggest that there is a formula that can be followed here. But it might be worthwhile following up in your departments about what are some ways that we can do this effectively. So yeah, many ways to frame this type of activity that makes student thinking visible. At the consortium, we look at 6 different ways. We call it to problematize learning. And when we frame questions and tasks that problematize the learning, then we make their thinking visible, and that gives us at least an opportunity to assess and evaluate if that's what we want to do. So each of these ways I can share with you in the Google folder that I put the thought book in. I can attach some more materials if you're interested, or I can email them out to you afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to pause again just for a minute and invite you to go back to the the thought book. Is there anything you want to capture in that second quadrant of making thinking visible? Okay, I'm conscious of our time, so I'm going to offer a little bit in the last two quadrants, and then I'm going to invite you to share something from your thought book, if you would like, in the chat box at the end, and also give you an opportunity to connect and some ideas about how we might connect if you'd like to look at this a little bit further. So what's in the third quadrant? Iterate. How can we help learning grow? How do we see learning as an evolving story? How do we make sure that we find multiple opportunities throughout that story to see learning as it grows? So I'm going to talk about instructional patterns. So there are all of us have, if we reflect on it, a pattern in the way that our lessons, our classes unfold, the way that our year unfolds. Could you draw that pattern? What do you start with? And I don't mean topics. I mean, what type of learning experiences are at the beginning of a class? Then what do you usually do? Then what do you usually do? Do you usually demonstrate first? Do you usually start with a discussion? What do you usually do? All of us have a pattern. And so I'm going to suggest an instructional pattern that can really support powerful assessment practices and can lead to more equitable and inclusive learning environments. I'll go through it quickly, but I think you'll see the relationships to things I've already talked about. If you take a critical inquiry approach, critical inquiry is best done iteratively. And so this is a very simple sort of cycle, but I'm going to quickly walk through this cycle. And as we walk through, I'm going to ask you, what are the places, at what points in this cycle what are the best places to assess or to evaluate student learning? And how might you do it? So imagine the following cycle. I shared an inquiry question and a challenge with you at the beginning of this session, and I suggest that that's really a great way to start classes, to start a unit, to start a course. What's the inquiry question and the challenge for the class or the course? Share it at the beginning, maybe co-constructed at the beginning. Maybe it's an authentic question or challenge that is actually being grappled with in your discipline. Share it at the beginning. This is what we're going to be thinking about throughout this course at a variety of times. Very quickly invite learners to capture their initial thinking. So I might do this at the beginning of every unit. Get them to write it down somewhere. Use a thought book. They don't have to hand it in, but can they capture it somewhere early in a space that they will return to? Then engage them in learning some tools and some content as you would regularly. So imagine this was a single 2-hour class. What's the inquiry question for your class? What's their initial thinking? Then, do 20 minutes of some learning, learn some tools, learn some content. Go back to that initial thinking. Go back to that thought book or to the challenge. What do you think now? What has changed now? Engage in some more learning, some more tools, some more content. Go back to that initial response. This cycle can really help support a pattern in which students are able to iterate their thinking and then immediately apply it. And that's something that I think a lot of students struggle with, is the application of the learning doesn't come until way down the line. And imagine if they're able to apply that learning immediately, regularly, and then not leave it, come back to it, apply it again, come back to it, apply it again. Those types of processes can really do a lot to bring students' shoulders down and say, well, don't worry, we're going to come back to this lots of times. Now, we have trained students to think the only reason to put anything on paper is if they're getting marked for it. Secondary schools have trained people. So there is some unlearning that has to happen here. And the first time you do this, students might say, well, are you collecting it? You're not collecting it, I'm not doing it. But when they start seeing the value of capturing, changing their mind, growing their thinking, and if they have a thought book, that's an anchor that they can use and continuously return to. You could sit down with them at some point and have a conversation as an evaluation piece and say, tell me what you thought at the beginning of this course. Tell me what changed your mind along the way. What were some pivotal theories, some pivotal concepts, some pivotal experiences that helped you learn this competency? When did you really start to understand this? When did you change your mind? That rich conversation can give you more information to truly evaluate a student's understanding and ability than a single snapshot. So here are some pieces as we pull them together that I'm going to invite you to think about how this inquiry approach that we're talking about might support more inclusive environments, more equitable outcomes. Which of the students who aren't typically or who haven't been successful in your courses might benefit from some of these practices? Because we have to always be asking ourselves the question, for whom are my practices working? And for whom are my practices not working? I am the one, I have some ability as an educator in that classroom to shift my practices. Because if there is some, especially if there's some pattern, if I am noticing that certain groups of students are not, my practices are not working for them, that tells me something about me. So I'm going to, again, be very conscious of our time. I know we didn't get to the last quadrant, but the last quadrant asks the question, and maybe I'll just quickly sort of connect to it. How do we capture along the way? These are great ideas, Usha, but I got too many students and I can't keep it all in my head. How am I supposed to capture it on the way? And so I think this is an ongoing conversation that might happen at a department level or with a thinking partner, is what might the mechanism what is a mechanism you might need to capture in the moment what you're looking for, when you saw it, what you heard and what you saw. And you might just start with these types of mechanisms as an assessment tool in order for feedback and guidance, as opposed to an evaluation tool that you put a mark on. But eventually over time, there are ways to use these types of tools where we capture learning in the moment to help support our evaluation as well. Okay, I'm going to stop there and I hope that that has given a bit of a picture about possibilities for assessment and evaluation practices. I think there were lots of questions that came up that I'm happy to engage with people in terms of how to tweak different types of assignments, how to curate some of those assessment tools, how to invite students into the process of co-constructing both the outcomes and the mechanisms by which they will demonstrate their learning around those outcomes. So hopefully there's some ideas there and some possibilities for further sort of thinking and collaboration. I would love for you in our last couple of minutes to put something in the chat box from your thought book. I'll give you two options. Something that you would like to affirm, refine, adopt, or abandon this year. So something you're thinking that you'll do differently or the same, or you'll grow your practice in, or how you're feeling about our time together today. I hope this was useful, what you're taking away from it. I'm going to just be quiet for 30 seconds and invite you to put something in the chat box from your thought book or from what's milling around in your mind. And then we will close. Okay, and as you're putting something in the chat box, I just want to say thank you to all of you for taking the time to really think critically about your own practices and being committed to thinking critically about your own practices. I know that your students are so grateful that you are thinking critically about your practice. And I would very much enjoy sort of connecting with you further. I'm going to do this. This QR code, and maybe I can very quickly put it back into the chat box, the link to the Google Doc. That takes you, I think it took you to a folder. Maybe it took you to a folder, I hope, not a doc. No, it took you to a document. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I will email maybe all the participants with a link to a folder. And in that folder, I will put the slides from today. I will put the 6 ways to problematize learning. And if you think of anything else that you think might be helpful, I would be happy to plop it in there for everybody. Thanks for your comments in the chat box. Thank you for attending. And please don't hesitate to be in touch. That's my, oh, I didn't give you my email address. I will put in the chat box. Please don't hesitate to be in touch. And I will be in touch with you with some more materials if that's useful. Thanks, am I giving it back to you, Phoebe?
Yeah, sure. Why not? It's 4 o'clock. Your timing is impeccable. Thank you, Usha. Thank you so much. As you can see by the comments in the chat, you've given everyone a lot to think about. I think our heads are spinning, but in a good way. And we can, maybe Saltese can also share your resources on our events page. Liz, you're nodding your head, right? We can make it available with the when we have the review and the video of the
With your
recording and
permission, of
everything.
course.
Yeah.
Usha.
Yeah, we can speak with you about that separately. So yes, on behalf of Saltese, and I think all the participants, Usha, we just want to say thank you again. That was very enlightening.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to everyone for coming. Sue posted the here the form link, but Sue, maybe post it again because there is so much activity in the chat. It already got lost at the top. It's very short, I promise everyone.
And I guess just to underscore what both Phoebe and Sue mentioned in the very beginning, you know, we are Saltese is trying to prepare these kinds of webinars, inviting people like Usha who are thoughtful and provide lots of insights. So if you have topics, concerns, you want to know more, please let us know as well. What do we want to help you understand and learn about the things you want to learn about? This is important that we help service your needs. Thanks.